when you look at healthcare, generally the loop of experimentation is very, very long. You come up with a new pill, a new therapy. It takes years and years and years before it becomes reality
Right.
for millions of people, or for even for a few thousands. But what's interesting is that within biohacking community, it's try fast, fail fast, learn fast. That is really cool, because you're sort of like treating your own body as a lab, because you're accountable to only yourself. Like, I mean, if your health is the outcome that you want, nobody else is actually accountable.
Well, and the measurements are a lot easier, right? Because it's like if my deadlift goes up when I try a new protocol, it's like it's very clear that this thing worked, right? I don't need somebody else to tell me that, hey, we did a double-blind, placebo-controlled clinical trial and this improved muscle strength. It's like, no, my deadlift went up. I know this worked for me. Now, does that work for everybody? That's what we don't know, and that's when you do need those larger trials and those larger studies. But yeah, I mean, and just back to your point about the 90s, yeah, definitely nobody was calling it biohacking back then. I mean, I didn't know to call myself a biohacker. I was just doing this. And, so I guess I've always been a biohacker in that sense.
No, absolutely. And one of the aspects that you mentioned that was really cool was, one is that it can give you deep personalization in terms of like who you are and what works for you, right? So if a particular method helps you reduce your resting heart rate and doesn't work for the other person, it's your method,
Right.
and you can discover your own. But then there is other aspect of experimentation which I want to get back to again, which is like really cool. The other important aspect which you mentioned was experimentation. I just want to double click a little bit on that. When you think about self experimentation, what are some of the ways to, or what are some of the things to experiment and measure? Because experimentation and measurement go hand in hand, right?
Right.
You can't experiment with what you can't measure. So maybe your top five, your favorite experimentation methods that you would have tried over the last few years, maybe some success stories and maybe some failures as well.
Okay, that's a good question, actually. That could go on for a while. Um, so I think really self experimentation is essentially applying the scientific method, right, to yourself. And so surprisingly, even people who call themselves biohackers don't really understand this. And I think, to be quite honest, a lot of them aren't doing it, right? That's why I said, to me, biohacking is part of quantify itself. So I'm what I call, I even add a qualifier these days. I call myself an evidence-based biohacker, because to me, that's when you're gathering the evidence, right, to biohack. So really, you have different ways to gather evidence. So there's the two main ones that people want to think about is objective and subjective. So up until recently, almost most of my life, I could only really gather subjective evidence, meaning that you take a supplement, do you feel better, right? Something says it's going to make you have higher cognition. It's going to help you with mental clarity. That's very hard to measure, right? So you kind of go, well, do I feel better? Is this nootropic making me a little more clear? That's very subjective. That's very personal and individualized, and it's kind of based on your own opinion. Now, the challenge with anybody who conducts rigorous science, your own opinion tends to be extremely biased, right? There's things called like placebo effect, there's expectation effect, there's all sorts of confounding factors, and people are actually rather bad at self-reporting. So I've participated in trials, where people will self-report that something only improved their performance, say 10%, but we're actually looking at blood markers and it actually improved them 30%. So they were reporting much less than it actually was, the outcome was. So there's a lot of problems with subjective reporting. But it's still something you use, so it's not like you don't include it. But what's been really exciting over the last 5 years is now we have things like wearable technology, at-home blood testing, as I mentioned before, and now you can get that objective data. So I can say, as you said before, I started a new fitness program, and my resting heart rate went down 10%. Now, I would be very hard to subjectively know that, right? But my nocturnal resting heart rate on my biowearable tells me my heart rate has gone down 10% and stayed there consistently since I started doing ice therapy, for example, right? So I started doing the cold plunges. I'm starting to do, contrast therapy, and I'm starting to notice these changes. So, those are the two main things to keep in mind. And the objective data, when we're doing research with people, we collect that in survey form, self-reporting. Objective, again, with biowearables, blood tests, or in-lab testing, right? So I guess maybe that was the first part of the question. The second part is what experiments worked for me and what didn't. Is that kind of what you want me to go into? Um, I guess the bottom line there is the vast majority of things actually don't work. I guess that's the bad news. I mean, even if you hear that they worked for other people, I would say probably, to be quite honest, my biggest experiment that was probably the most difficult for me to deal with was around diet and nutrition. That's a really hard one to dial in. When I was in college, I was studying exercise science. I had a professor who really kind of put me on to more like plant-based eating, more into the vegetarian side. And I spent a lot of my life being being vegetarian, leaning more towards sort of a plant-based diet. And as I've gotten older, I've become now more of an animal-based diet, and my performance has gone up significantly when I ate with age. Now, diet is a very personalized thing. It ties into our belief systems, our socialization. It's a complicated bit to get into, but diet and nutrition are something that are probably the most difficult to dial in and probably one of the most personalized. And that's where we hope that the microbiome science is going to start to give us insights there, right? So there's a lot of potential that, will be right now. Unfortunately, there's a lot of companies promising a lot on microbiome science, but I think it's still fairly early. I think when we do unlock it, though, that's going to be the game-changing aspect. Like, that's probably 10 years from now. Most health decisions will be around, we analyze the microbiome. This is what we want you to do. Here's the therapeutics we're going to give you. Even medicine realizes that that's where it's going to go. So, so that was one big challenge, was dialing in my nutrition. That took me decades, to be quite honest. So I guess I could call, I spent a lot of time in a failed experiment there trying to figure out what worked.